The lecture hall at Whitmore University smelled like old wood and privilege. Professor Daniel Harrington stood at the blackboard, chalk dust coating his expensive suit jacket, staring at an equation that had stumped every mind in the room. Behind him sat 30 graduate students, the best mathematics candidates in the country, silent and defeated. This wasn't just any problem. This was the Harrington conjecture, an unsolved theorem that had humiliated mathematicians for 2 decades. Daniel had written it across 3 full blackboards, offering a $10,000 prize and automatic admission to anyone who could crack it. No one ever had. At the back of the hall, barely visible in the dim corner, an older black man in a janitor's uniform pushed a cleaning cart slowly between the rows. His name was Samuel Cross, 63 years old, with silver hair and hands permanently stained from years of cleaning chemical work. Students didn't look at him. Professors walked past him as if he were furniture. That afternoon, Samuel paused near the blackboard, his eyes lifting toward the chalk symbols sprawled across the wall. His brow furrowed slightly. His lips moved without sound. Professor Harrington noticed the hesitation and frowned. "Can I help you with something?" His tone wasn't cruel, just dismissive, the way you'd speak to someone interrupting important work. Samuel shook his head quickly. "No, sir. Just cleaning." But his eyes stayed on the board. One of the students, a sharp-eyed woman named Grace, noticed the way Samuel's gaze traced the equation from left to right, pausing at specific intervals, as if reading a language only he understood. She elbowed her classmate and whispered, "Is he actually looking at the math?" Her classmate snorted, probably just wondering when we'll leave so he can mop. But Samuel didn't move. His hand, still gripping the mop handle, twitched slightly. Then, almost unconsciously, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small piece of chalk he'd picked up off the floor earlier that week. The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward him. Professor Harrington's voice sharpened. "Excuse me? What are you doing?" Samuel looked at him, apologetic, but oddly calm. "I'm sorry, sir. I think there's a mistake." The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. One student laughed nervously. Another whispered, "Is he serious?" Harrington's face flushed red. "A mistake. In my conjecture," Samuel nodded slowly. "Not in the conjecture itself, sir. In the 3rd line of your proof attempt. You're using Leibniz notation, but you switched frameworks midstream without adjusting the boundary conditions." The room exploded into murmurs. Harrington's jaw tightened. "That's absurd." Samuel didn't argue. He just stepped forward, chalk in hand, and wrote a single line beneath Harrington's work. His handwriting was shaky, but precise. The equation flowed naturally, elegantly, connecting to previously unrelated sections of the proof. Then he stepped back. Harrington stared. His eyes darted from the board to Samuel, then back again. His breathing quickened. Grace stood up from her seat, moving closer to the board, her hand covering her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He's right." Harrington's face went pale. He grabbed his own chalk and began scribbling furiously, checking Samuel's correction against his original work, line by line. The tension in the room was suffocating. Students leaned forward in their seats. Some pulled out their phones, snapping pictures of the board. Finally, Harrington stopped writing. He turned to face Samuel, his voice barely a whisper. "How did you see that?" Samuel looked down at his feet. I've been watching you teach for years, sir. I listen while I clean." Harrington blinked, stunned. "You've been learning advanced mathematics by listening to my lectures while mopping floors." Samuel nodded once. "Yes, sir." The professor opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. No words came. Grace broke the silence. "Professor, if he corrected your error, doesn't that mean he just solved the Harrington conjecture?" Every head in the room swiveled toward Samuel. Harrington's hands trembled. He looked at the board again, tracing Samuel's correction through to its logical conclusion. His entire body seemed to sag under the weight of realization. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, he did." The room erupted. Students rushed forward, crowding around the blackboard, pulling out notebooks, taking photos, arguing excitedly over the implications. Samuel stood frozen, overwhelmed, clutching his mop like a lifeline. One student, a tall man with glasses, turned to him and asked breathlessly, "Who are you?" Samuel swallowed hard. "I'm just the janitor." But Grace shook her head firmly. "No, you're not." Before anyone could say more, Harrington held up a hand for silence. His face was ashen, his voice unsteady. "Clear the room. Everyone out." Now the students hesitated, confused, but his tone left no room for argument. They filed out slowly, whispering to each other, casting glances back at Samuel. When the last student left, Harrington closed the door and locked it. He turned to Samuel, his expression unreadable. "Sit down." Samuel obeyed, lowering himself carefully into one of the student chairs, his cleaning cart abandoned in the corner. Harrington pulled a chair across from him and sat elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked quietly. "Listening, learning." Samuel hesitated. "About 12 years, sir." Harrington looked up sharply. 12 years. You've been cleaning this building for 12 years? Teaching yourself graduate-level mathematics by eavesdropping on my lectures?" Samuel nodded. "And others, sir, Professor Lin's topology classes, Dr. Mabecki's seminars on differential geometry. I didn't mean any harm. I love it. I always have." Harrington's voice cracked. "Then why are you a janitor?" The question hung heavy in the air. Samuel's shoulders sagged. He looked away, his voice barely audible. "Because I didn't have a choice, sir." He told the story slowly, painfully. How he'd been accepted to MIT at 18, a full scholarship, a future brighter than anything his family had ever imagined. How his father had a stroke 2 weeks before classes started. How his mother worked 3 jobs but still couldn't cover the medical bills. How Samuel had deferred his admission, then deferred again, then watched it expire while he worked double shifts at a warehouse to keep his parents home. How his mother died 5 years later. How his father followed 6 months after that. How by the time Samuel was free to pursue his own dreams, he was 35 years old, broke, and considered too old for scholarships or second chances. "So I took the only job I could get," Samuel said quietly, "and I listened. I learned. Because even if I couldn't sit in those chairs, I could still hear the beauty of it." Harrington covered his face with both hands. When he pulled them away, his eyes were wet. "You've wasted your life cleaning my floors when you should have been teaching beside me." Samuel shook his head. "I didn't waste it, sir. I loved every minute I got to hear you teach." That broke something in Harrington. He stood abruptly, pacing the room, running his hands through his hair. "This is unacceptable. This is a crime. This is—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes locking on Samuel with sudden intensity. "You're not cleaning another floor in this building. Ever." Samuel's eyes widened. "Sir, I need this job." "I can't," Harrington cut him off. "You'll still have a job, but not this one." He pulled out his phone and made a call, his voice rapid and commanding. "Dean Mitchell, Daniel Harrington." I need an emergency meeting with you and the board. Tonight? Yes, tonight. Because I just discovered the most brilliant mathematical mind I've encountered in 30 years. And he's been scrubbing our toilets for over a decade." Samuel's heart hammered in his chest. "Professor, you don't have to—" Harrington held up a hand, still speaking into the phone. "And I'm using my tenure and my personal funds, if necessary, to ensure he's offered a full faculty position by the end of the week. No, I'm not joking. I'll explain everything when I see you." He hung up and turned back to Samuel. "Can you be here tomorrow at 9 a.m.? Not in that uniform." "As yourself?" Samuel's voice shook. I don't have anything else to wear." Harrington paused, then pulled out his wallet and handed Samuel $200. "Buy something." And Samuel. The older man looked up, tears streaming silently down his face. "Thank you," Harrington said, his own voice breaking. "Thank you for not giving up on the thing you love, even when the world gave up on you." Samuel couldn't speak. He just nodded, clutching the money in his trembling hands. The next morning, Samuel Cross walked into Whitmore University wearing a simple button-down shirt and slacks he'd bought at a thrift store. He'd barely slept. His hands still smelled faintly of cleaning solution, a scent he couldn't quite wash away after 12 years. When he reached the administration building, a secretary greeted him with a warm smile he wasn't used to receiving. "Mr. Cross, they're waiting for you in the boardroom." His stomach twisted. He followed her down a long hallway lined with portraits of distinguished professors and university founders, faces that had never looked like his. The boardroom doors opened. Inside sat Dean Mitchell, 3 board members, Professor Harrington, and 2 Samuels Schock. Professor Lin and Dr. Mabecki, whose lectures he'd also quietly absorbed over the years. Harrington stood immediately. "Samuel, please, sit." Samuel lowered himself into the chair at the head of the table, feeling wildly out of place. Dean Mitchell, a thin woman with sharp eyes and silver hair, leaned forward. "Mr. Cross, Professor Harrington has made some extraordinary claims about your abilities." Samuel swallowed hard. "I just solved one problem, ma'am." "That doesn't you solved the Harrington conjecture," she interrupted. "A problem that has stumped professional mathematicians globally for 20 years. And you did it in under 3 minutes with a piece of chalk while holding a mop." She paused, letting that sink in. "We've spent the last 12 hours verifying your solution with external experts. It's flawless." Samuel's breath caught. Professor Lin spoke next, her voice soft but firm. "I reviewed the recordings of my lectures from the past 5 years. Security footage shows you in the back of the room during 14 of my sessions. You were always cleaning, but your eyes were always on the board." Dr. McKay added, "Same with my seminars." "I went back and checked. You attended more consistently than half of my enrolled students." Samuel felt heat rising in his face, shame and pride tangled together. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." Harrington's voice was sharp. "Stop apologizing. You've done nothing wrong." "We have." The room fell silent. Harrington stood, pacing to the window, his back to the group. This man taught himself advanced mathematics by listening through doorways while scrubbing floors. He was denied access to education not because he lacked ability, but because life was unfair. And we, this institution, never noticed, never asked, never looked. He turned back to face the board. "That ends today." Dean Mitchell nodded slowly. "Agreed." She slid a folder across the table toward Samuel. "Mr. Cross, we'd like to offer you a position as a visiting lecturer in the mathematics department, effective immediately." Salary commensurate with your demonstrated expertise. Full benefits, and if you're interested, we'll sponsor your formal graduate education, fully funded so you can earn the credentials you were robbed of 30 years ago. Samuel stared at the folder, unable to move. I don't understand. You've already proven yourself, Harrington said gently. You've been learning at a doctoral level for over a decade. We're just making it official. Dr. Mbeki smiled. And selfishly, I'd love to collaborate with you on a project I've been stuck on for 2 years. I have a feeling you've already figured out the answer. The room waited. Samuel's hand shook as he opened the folder. Inside was a contract, an offer letter, and a photo of a small office with his name on the door. Samuel Cross, visiting lecturer, Department of Mathematics. He covered his mouth, tears spilling freely now. I thought I'd never get to be part of this world. Not really. Dean Mitchell's voice softened. You've always been part of it, Mr. Cross. We just failed to see you. Samuel nodded, unable to speak, and signed the contract with a trembling hand. 3 months later, Samuel Cross stood at the front of the same lecture hall where he'd once pushed a cleaning cart. But now he held chalk as a teacher, not a cleaner. The room was packed. Word had spread fast about the janitor-turned-professor, and students fought for seats in his classes. He was a patient teacher, kind and deeply humble, never forgetting what it felt like to learn from the margins. One afternoon, after class, Grace approached him. She'd become one of his most dedicated students. Professor Cross, can I ask you something personal? Samuel smiled. Of course. Why didn't you give up? Why keep learning when no one was watching? He thought for a long moment, then said quietly, because the math didn't care if I was a janitor or a professor. It was beautiful either way, and beauty doesn't need permission. She nodded, eyes bright with emotion. That's the best thing anyone's ever taught me. That evening, Samuel walked across campus, no longer invisible, students greeting him by name, colleagues waving from across the quad. He passed the administration building and saw his own face on the faculty board, his name listed among the professors. He stopped, staring at it, and whispered to himself, Dad would have been proud. A voice behind him said, I'm sure he is. Samuel turned. Harrington stood there, hands in his pockets, smiling gently. I owe you an apology I never properly gave, Harrington said. I walked past you for years, looked through you. I'm ashamed of that. Samuel shook his head. You gave me a chance when it mattered most. That's all I needed. Harrington extended his hand. Partners. Samuel gripped it firmly. Partners. As they walked together toward the mathematics building, Samuel felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Certainty. Not that life would be easy, but that he was finally, undeniably, exactly where he belonged. 6 months later, on a cold November morning, 4 black SUVs rolled onto the Whitmore University campus. Students paused mid-conversation, watching curiously as the vehicles parked in front of the administration building. Doors opened. Out stepped a delegation from the National Science Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, and 2 representatives from MIT's mathematics department. They were led by a tall woman in a sharp suit, Dr. Evelyn Torres, director of the NSF's mathematics division. She walked directly into Dean Mitchell's office without an appointment. We're here to see Samuel Cross, she said. Dean Mitchell blinked, surprised. May I ask why? Dr. Torres smiled. Because his solution to the Harrington conjecture unlocked a proof framework that's been referenced in 17 new papers in the last 4 months. He's revolutionizing fieldwork he hasn't even published yet. She paused. and we'd like to offer him the MacArthur Fellowship, but we prefer to do it in person." An hour later, Samuel was pulled out of his office mid-lecture prep and escorted to the dean's conference room. When he walked in and saw the delegation, his heart nearly stopped. "Mr. Cross," Dr. Torres said warmly, "we've been trying to reach you." Samuel's voice was unsteady. "I'm sorry. I don't understand," she smiled. "We're here to tell you that your work matters, not just the conjecture, but the way you've approached teaching, learning, and resilience. You've inspired more people in 6 months than most scholars do in a lifetime." She slid an envelope across the table. "The MacArthur Foundation would like to award you a fellowship. Unrestricted funding for the next 5 years to pursue whatever research you choose." Samuel's knees buckled. He sat down hard, staring at the envelope. This doesn't happen to people like me." Dr. Torres leaned forward, her voice firm but kind. "It should, and now it is." When the news broke, it went viral. News outlets covered the story. Janitor becomes award-winning mathematician. Social media exploded with support, with people sharing their own stories of delayed dreams and second chances. Samuel received letters from around the world, from students who'd dropped out, from workers who'd given up, from people who thought it was too late. He answered every one. One letter stood out. It was from a 16-year-old girl in Detroit named Amara who wrote, "My teacher said I'm too poor to be good at math. But then I read about you. Now I know she's wrong." Samuel framed that letter and hung it in his office. It reminded him every day why he showed up, why he kept teaching, why he refused to let the world define him by what he'd lost instead of what he'd learned. On the 1-year anniversary of solving the Harrington conjecture, the university held a ceremony in Samuel's honor. The lecture hall was packed with students, faculty, and reporters. Harrington gave the introduction, his voice thick with emotion. "A year ago, I thought I knew what genius looked like. I was wrong. Genius isn't about where you sit, it's about what you see. And Samuel Cross saw what none of us could." Samuel took the stage to thunderous applause.